Then the Lord said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. You are to worship at a distance, but Moses alone is to approach the Lord. The others must not come near, and the people may not come up with him." When Moses went and told the people all the Lord's words and laws, they responded with one voice, "Everything the Lord has said, we will do." Moses then wrote down everything the Lord had said. He got up early the next morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 stone pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent young Israelite men, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as fellowship offerings to the Lord. Moses took half of the blood and put it in the bowls, and the other half he splashed against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. Then they responded, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." Moses then took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." This is the word of the Lord.
Okay. Now, this is the part that I enjoy. Announcements, not so much. So we've been walking through the book of Exodus since February, and we have taken a couple-week break. We had Street Church a couple weeks ago, and then last week we had our baptism out at Lake Charles. And so now we are back in the book of Exodus. So to catch us up, we left off a few weeks back. The children of Israel, the people of Israel, had traveled from Egypt, where God brought them out of slavery, through the Red Sea, and they are now in the wilderness. They traveled to Mount Sinai. God set Moses down off the mountain. We talked about a month ago. We talked about the 10 Commandments, and then 3 weeks ago. Yeah, 3 weeks ago, when we were last in Exodus, we went from Exodus 20 to 23, and we talked about the law, what it was, what it wasn't, and the purpose of it, and how it pertains to us. And so now in chapter 24, we have this scene where God invites Moses, Aaron, and the elders up onto the mountain with him, and then the law is presented to the people, and what do they say? All that the Lord has said, we will do. There's a commitment there. And then, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk us through this chapter, because again, the kind of our theme for this series is this is our story. As we look at the story, the historical story of the people of Israel, we can also see ourselves. And that's not an accident. That is on purpose. And as we read the New Testament, if we'll really read the Old Testament, and then when we go to the New Testament, we see the Old Testament a lot, and the New Testament brings new life to everything that we read in the Old Testament. In a lot of ways, we read the Old Testament, and some of us don't really spend a lot of time there because there's a lot of stuff that happens that seems kind of confusing and doesn't really seem like it applies to us. But if we pay careful attention to that and then go to the New Testament, what the New Testament does is actually show us what the Old Testament was actually saying. And so we can find new life, we can find deeper worship, deeper relationship with God as we see what his plan was from the beginning and how he's brought it about in such a beautiful and faithful way. So we are going to start in verse 1. Okay, verse 1 and 2, God tells Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and the 70 elders to come up on the mountain and worship from afar. But Moses alone is going to draw near. Okay, these are details that we just kind of read over, and this is really important. Why can only Moses come to God? Right? We have them drawing near, which we'll talk about in a minute because that's a change. But then only Moses gets to draw near. And as we've talked all along, in the New Testament, we see explicitly and we see it implicitly that Jesus is the new and better Moses. That Jesus went up to God when we couldn't. Jesus goes before God on our behalf and then makes it able for us to come near to God as well. So we see Moses foreshadowing what Jesus is going to do. Now, what we also see is that if we went backwards a couple chapters, there was this scene where God said, make sure you, to put a boundary on the foot of the mountain and make sure that no men or beasts touch the foot of the mountain. Otherwise what? They'll die. Right? They were confronted with the holiness of God that they could not draw near. And now we have an invitation for the 70 elders and for Moses and Aaron to come up on the mountain and worship God. Something must have changed. So let's look at what changed. In verses 3 through 8, we have the book of the covenant read by Moses to the people, and the people respond, all that the Lord has said we will do. Now, if we stop and think about this, we see something happening here that we perform as men and women. When we grow to a certain age and meet someone that we want to spend our life with, we say those words. We don't say them exactly, but when we come together and make a marriage covenant, there are vows, and then we repeat after whoever, I do. I will. We are making a covenant promise. That's what's happening here. The people of Israel and God are coming together in a type of marriage ceremony and making covenant promises. And then they have this scene that Seven just read for us where they're sacrificing the bulls and the calves, and Moses takes the blood and he sprinkles half of it on the altar. And then after the people say, we do, we will, all that the Lord has spoken, we will obey, he takes the second half of the blood and he sprinkles it on the people. Now, most of us are already thinking like, aha, we see where this is going. But do we see the beautiful foreshadowing that's happening here? This is our story. The covenant that is being made is not just like, yes, we agree to follow the Ten Commandments. This is a much deeper and more significant covenant. They are saying, we will be your people and you will be our God. And they are trusting in and putting faith in the faithfulness of God. And they are making sacrifices on behalf of themselves because they know of their own inadequacy. God decrees the terms of the covenant, and the people agree. Now, again, Moses takes the first half and throws it against the altar, takes the second half, and he throws it on the people. And then he says, behold the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. This is the sealing of the covenant that God has made with his people. Now, here's one of the really weird things about the Bible that sometimes we have questions about. Why blood? Because if I'm coming to church and the pastor gets up and takes a bowl of blood and starts throwing handfuls of blood on me, I'm out. Right? That's weird. We only do that when we're hunting. I don't know why hunting's coming up again. I think it's because it's the middle of August and the end of August is coming. But I remember a few years ago, my daughter killed her first buck, and we went up to it, and I got a little bit of blood on my hands, and I put some on her face, and she was freaking out, and it was like this initiation. That's what's kind of happening here. But this one is an eternally significant initiation. Some of you are like, dude, I'm out. This place is weird. I apologize. The blood that we see in the covenant is significant because blood is life. Blood represents life. And the sacrifice and the blood that is sacrificed represents the covering of something that is inadequate, that has been covered by the sacrifice of someone else. The lifeblood of someone else has been sacrificed to cover the failures and the inadequacies. And so what we see in the Old Testament is the sacrifice of God's creation And that blood being a foreshadowing, listen, let's be really clear. No one's sins were ever forgiven by the blood of the sacrifice of an animal. I want to be very clear about that. This is a foreshadowing of what Christ would do once for all in the past and in the future. It is an act of faith that they were performing because God asked them to perform it as a foreshadowing of what would come, even though they didn't know what would come. So we have to understand that fact. No one ever had their sins forgiven by the blood of an animal. Their sins were forgiven by placing their faith in God. This was an act of submission in their faith in what he would do. But that's the significance of the blood. We have the lifeblood of one being sacrificed to cover the sins of another. Now, let's go to the New Testament and read a little bit more about this. In Hebrews chapter 9, if you read the whole chapter of Hebrews chapter 9, you'll go like, oh, this makes a little bit more sense. I'm just going to read you a couple different sections. We're going to read starting in verse 18. It says, therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses, he's referring to this chapter that we're in. He's referring to Exodus 24. When every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet, wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, this is the blood of the covenant that God has commanded for you. And in the same way, he sprinkled, we'll get to this later on in a couple chapters, he sprinkled both the tent, that's the tabernacle, and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood. Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin. Let me say that again. Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin. This is justice. God's justice. God would not be a just God if he did not operate justly, consistently, in all cases. God doesn't get to pick and choose. God is a just God. Therefore, he requires blood for the forgiveness of sins. Let's go back a little bit to verse 11, also in Hebrews chapter 9. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then, though the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. See, this is the writer of Hebrews saying that they were practicing both with the tabernacle, right, and the sacrifices, a temporary foreshadowing of what would come that would be eternal. What was to come that was eternal? Jesus was to come that was eternal. He is the sacrifice that would provide eternal salvation and redemption for all people that put their trust and hope in him. And his Spirit would be given to us, no longer confined to a temple, but indwelt in every one of us who are also, according to his promises, eternally chosen. They were practicing for us. They were practicing something that we will carry out. And they are cheering us on. When we get to Hebrews chapter 11, it says that we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. And that's actually in Hebrews 12. Hebrews 11 is the hall of faith, right? Where he goes down through all the Old Testament saints who lived by faith in God. And then it starts Hebrews 12 with, they're sitting in heaven cheering you on. Because they were practicing for you. The foreshadowing was for you. So that we could see the excellencies of God more deeply, more richly, more clearly. through the Old Testament, through the law even. Let's look at 1 Peter chapter 1. Peter opens his book this way. He says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion. So what had happened was that the church kind of centered in Jerusalem, right? Because that's where Jesus died and that's where the disciples were. But then what happened is that there was persecution. And so they were dispersed across the Roman Empire. And so that's what Peter is referring to. He's writing letters to all these different churches, and he refers to them as the elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father and the sanctification of the Spirit for obedience to Jesus Christ and for the sprinkling with his blood. You see, the apostles already, like 20, 30, 40 years after Jesus died, were already teaching the New Testament church that these connections were there. Because these people that were now coming to faith in Jesus Christ had been raised in the Old Testament law. And so the apostles were now making these connections for them that we get to read the Bible and then glean from ourselves, that these things that they grew up in were foreshadowing of what Christ had just done in their lifetime. And this idea that they were sprinkled with blood, sealed by his blood, redeemed by his blood, elected by his blood, foreknown by his blood. I was thinking the other day, we have the parable that Jesus tells about the shepherd that has 100 sheep. And he loses one. And it says he leaves the 99 and he goes and he finds the one. And I think sometimes that when we read that, we think, man, I'm the one. And Jesus came for me. And our attention is drawn to the one, which is the wrong place to put our attention. Where should our attention be in that story? Our attention should be on the shepherd. What kind of shepherd leaves 99 sheep to go find one? It seems a little crazy. Because what happens to the other 99? They might wander off. And then he just has the one and he doesn't have the 99. What kind of shepherd does this? That's where our attention should be as we read these Old Testament stories, as we read about the blood of bulls and goats, as we read about all the things in the law, our attention should be drawn to the lawgiver. Our attention should be drawn to the one who is making a way for his people to be his people because he loves them so much. Every day when we open the scriptures, our attention should be drawn to him. We have been sanctified and sealed, set apart by the blood of Jesus. Isaiah writes about this as well in Isaiah 52, in his song about the suffering servant. He says, "Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up and shall be exalted." That sounds awesome, right? Exalted, high and lifted up. Let's keep reading. "As many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind." So, what he's saying is that the suffering servant, talking about Jesus, who was to come in several hundred years, would be high and lifted up. How would he be high and lifted up? He'd be beaten so severely that he wouldn't be recognized as a human, and he would be nailed to a cross and would be lifted high up for all to see. By the way, Jesus in John chapter 12 actually says that this is how he's going to be exalted. Through his death, through his crucifixion, through his sacrifice, through the pouring out of his blood. He will be inaugurated as king through his sacrifice. That's what Isaiah said in the Old Testament. It's what Jesus said before his death, and it's what he carried out. And then, so now let's get back to Exodus 24, right? So the elders, Moses and Aaron, are invited to come up, and then there's the pause They do the sacrifice. He sprinkles everybody with the blood. So now we see, aha, now we know how they're able to go up onto the mountain because they have been sprinkled, they have been purified, they have been sanctified to be able to come into God's presence. And then what happens? They go up on the mountain and they sit and they eat with God. Does that trip you out? That trips me out every time I read this. The 70 elders, they go up on the mountain and they feast with God. They have a meal with God and they see him. What an unbelievable thing. And look at verse 11. He did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank. Again, let's think about how we worship God. And let's think about the scriptures and how they're kind of walking forward, taking us by the hand and slowly showing us just how wonderful and how beautiful he is. Now, in those days, and in our days, right, meals were intimate things that were done among friends. Right? If you wanted to show someone honor, if you wanted to really communicate to someone that you love them, you invited them over for a meal. So this is why, like a lot of what Jesus was doing during his ministry was so crazy to people, because he was going around eating with the enemies, right? The tax collectors, the sinners, the drunkards. He was having meals with those that were unclean, that didn't keep the law, that some had rejected the law or were using the law to oppress people, because then he would go eat with the Pharisees. And his followers, who the rejects, would go like, wait, now what's he doing? Why is he going with them? He broke all of these paradigms around who you were supposed to eat with. He broke all the rules, and that's part of what made everybody hate him. But that's exactly what God's doing. You see it? God's eating a meal with people that he had saved out of slavery, who day after day after day, since they were slaved, had whined and complained that he had brought them out in the desert to kill them. They were so unfaithful. They were so unfaithful, and yet he is providing a way for them to be sanctified so that they can come up on the mountain, to be in his presence, and to eat a meal with him. This is our God, and this is our story. And I'm hoping that you guys are already making the connections of what's to come. It says they beheld God, and they ate and drank. So we have all these, again, we have all these parables and all these stories about Jesus and what he is doing, the feeding of the 5,000, right? Jesus is teaching these people. A huge crowd gathers out in the wilderness to hear him teach. And then lunchtime comes along, and the disciples are like, hey, Jesus, let's pause so they can go into town and get some Chick-fil-A. And Jesus says, no, you guys give them something to eat. And they're like, we don't have anything. We just have this sack lunch that this one kid brought. Has a few fish and some loaves of bread. So Jesus prays for it, the food, and then gives it to his disciples to hand out to everybody. And it says that everybody ate. 5,000 men plus women and children. So probably closer to 10,000 people, all fed with one little kid's sack lunch. And the New Testament writers understand that there's something more significant happening here than just Jesus saying, you got no food, now you have food. He's providing a way for them to enter into the presence of God and to eat a meal with him. That's what's actually happening on that day. And John chapter 6 actually ties this to the Passover feast that we talked about, that the Israelites ate as they left Egypt. And now we're going like, wait a second, the Passover meal is also what we do here at church every Sunday. When we take communion, because Jesus, right before he was crucified, took the Passover meal and said, hey, this is about me. Right? This was all a foreshadowing of me. It was all practicing for you to see me and what I'm going to do. And so now hopefully your brain is just going crazy. Like all of these things, all of these meals, all of this blood, it was all practicing so that we might see and glorify Jesus. In Exodus 24, verse 8, again, Moses says, behold, after he sprinkles the people, he says what? Behold the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. Let's go to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26, the Last Supper. As they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, broke and gave it to the disciples and said, take, eat, this is my body. And then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them and said, drink it, all of you, for this is what? My blood of the covenant. Jesus is using his words very carefully. He wants them to understand exactly what is happening. Exodus 24, the blood of the covenant, Jesus is quoting directly during the Last Supper and saying, this blood is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, you will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it with you in my Father's kingdom. Okay, so let's look at the meal again, right? Exodus 24, they go up on the mountain, they eat a meal with God. Jesus is eating a meal with his disciples, and he says, we're going to do this again, but it won't be until when? Till I come back, eternity, when we are together in my Father's house and we are feasting for eternity. This is our story. We have been promised this very thing. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 says this as well. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? As we start to look more closely at this meal, we see the richness, right? We are remembering the Lord's death. We are remembering the Lord's resurrection. We are remembering that forgiveness of sins does not ever come without the shedding of blood, and yet he shed his blood for us. We are remembering that the new covenant is established through Christ's blood, and we are remembering that we are sealed through that blood. Sealed. Sealed as in when a king sealed something, it was unbreakable. There was absolute authority that a king had. And we now serve the King of Kings, the creator of the universe. When he says something, it will happen. So this is why you and I are able, like if we will have faith in that and in those promises, we can live this life with such utter confidence and love and selflessness that the world around us goes, they're weird. Why do I love them so much? Why do I hate them so much and yet love them so much? Because I can't put my finger on them. I can't categorize them because everything that I know according to this world doesn't apply to them. We can have that confidence because of the promises of God that this world cannot touch us. This is what we should be thinking each and every Sunday as we come and we worship at his feet. We have been invited into his presence to worship, to exalt him, and to eat a meal with him. You and I, every Sunday we come into church, are practicing Exodus 24. We have been sprinkled with blood. We have entered the covenant with Christ. And we have been invited into his presence collectively. Isn't that beautiful? Now, I want us to understand this, that when we read the Old Testament, we can see it this way. Hopefully, for the rest of your life, every time you read Exodus 24, you're going to be like, man, I want to go to church. Because I get to be with the people of God, in the presence of God, and eat a meal as friends. As friends. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to pray, and we're going to sing, and then we're going to eat a meal with our God. Amen?